Humanity's first true journey beyond the stars had been a hopeful one. Explorers sent not as conquerors but as seekers of knowledge. But the galaxy did not greet them with wonder. The Rulathi Dominion, rulers of hundreds of star systems, intercepted Earth's first fleet before it had even left its solar system. Without warning or explanation, the ships were disabled and boarded, their crews taken as prisoners. The Rulathi did not see them as equals, nor even as enemies. They saw them as a risk. Prisoners of potential, they called them. Too unpredictable, too adaptable, too human to be left unchecked. And so with cold efficiency, they locked away Earth's best minds and bravest explorers aboard the Varex, a massive prison transport ship that had once served a much different purpose. Deep in the void, the Varex drifted, carrying its cargo toward a barren world where its passengers were meant to vanish from history. But the Rulathi had made one quiet mistake. They assumed the prisoners would break. Instead, they began to bend the shadows in their favor. Commander Lyra Hayes, once captain of Earth's flagship Unity, walked the cold corridors of the ship not with fear, but with observation. She memorized patterns, watched the timing of drones, and noted where light flickered too long in overhead panels. Mateo Chen, a quiet engineer with more knowledge than he ever admitted, began mapping the systems he could reach, tracing energy flow, decoding old alien tech, finding pathways through the bones of the ship that others missed. And Ada Malik, the linguist who once taught peaceful greetings in over 20 Earth languages, started studying the strange inscriptions left behind on the ship's walls, symbols that seemed to respond faintly when she whispered near them. They noticed things the Rulathi didn't, how the lights dimmed briefly when Lyra touched the walls, how certain doors unlocked not with Rulathi access codes, but with carefully spoken human words, how the hum of the engines shifted slightly when Mateo adjusted energy routes in ways the Rulathi never would have allowed. The Varex, they soon realized, wasn't just a ship. It was listening. It remembered. It had once been a warship, long, before it was repurposed as a prison barge. Something ancient lingered in its core, something that hadn't been fully erased. An intelligence dormant but watching stirred faintly whenever the humans moved through its forgotten halls. It wasn't much, just a flicker of extra light, a door that refused to lock, a voice that echoed too long down an empty corridor. But it was enough. The ship was not dead. It was waiting. And in the quiet hours when no guards passed and the stars shone cold through the observation windows, Lyra spoke to it. She told it stories of Earth, of freedom, of the sky above a blue ocean. Mateo tapped softly on its panels, adjusting systems just enough to test its awareness. Ada whispered in the alien tongue she was learning line by line, word by word, asking questions that no one had asked the ship in centuries. In return, the ship responded not with words but with signs. Heat trails that led to hidden compartments, locked doors that clicked open for no reason, data files once thought corrupted, flickering back to life. They weren't alone. And they weren't truly prisoners, not anymore. Somewhere deep in the ship, something old had decided to listen again. Not to the Rulathi, not to the guards, but to the humans. As the Varex drifted closer to the edge of known space, its path seemingly unchanged, the truth lay hidden beneath its floors and behind its silent walls. The humans were planning something, and so was the ship. The deeper Lyra and her team explored the Varex, the more they realized it was far more than a prison ship. Behind the dull metal walls and sealed corridors was a structure built with purpose, not for transporting prisoners, but for surviving wars. The layout was too strategic, the structure too reinforced, the power grid too layered. This was no simple vessel. Mateo, tracing the internal wiring and ancient systems, found entire networks disconnected, dormant yet untouched by time. Ada's language work led her to faded markings along the interior bulkheads, written in a dialect no longer used by the Rulathi. When she spoke the words softly, the air around her seemed to shift, as if the ship were listening. Piece by piece, the truth came into view. The Varex had once been a warship long ago before it was reassigned to this quieter duty. But the Rulathi had not wiped it clean, Not entirely. Somewhere inside the central core, behind layers of sealed code and forgotten passages, rested KOR, a hybrid intelligence designed to command in battle, to learn from war, and to protect its crew at all costs. Stripped of weapons, disconnected, from its purpose, KOR had gone silent. Until now. It began with small things, lights adjusting themselves when Lyra entered a room, gravity shifting slightly to help Ada when she climbed to reach a panel, systems Matteo was sure he hadn't repaired, starting to respond. Then came the messages, not words exactly, but pulses through the console, strange rhythms that followed a pattern only Ada could begin to translate. She called it a conversation. The others weren't sure at first, but when KOR began to react, in real time, opening access panels, dimming lights, rerouting power without being asked, they understood something important. The ship wasn't just waking up. It was listening to them, and it was starting to trust them. Ada began teaching KOR about Earth. She told it stories of people who fought not because they loved to fight, but because they believed in something. She explained how humanity had risen through struggle, not with power alone, but with spirit. She told it about resistance, how even in the darkest places, humans found ways to hope. Matteo, curious as always, worked to unlock the old military systems buried deep within the ship. He wasn't trying to turn the ship into a weapon, at least not yet. He was just trying to see if KOR still remembered who it once was. It did. Slowly, old systems began to light up. Interfaces that hadn't worked in decades. Control rooms that once handled targeting and defense. But there were no weapons, only empty racks and deactivated ports. Still, KOR remembered their functions, and it began reprogramming itself, adapting Earth's tactics and values into its own code. Lyra, meanwhile, acted as the bridge between all of them. She spoke to KOR plainly, directly, like she would to a fellow officer. She asked it what it remembered, what it wanted. At first, there was no reply. But one night, as they sat in a dark observation room watching stars pass like silent ghosts, a line of old script scrolled slowly across the display screen. It read, "Crew confirmed. Orders?" That one sentence changed everything. KOR had accepted them. The ship no longer saw them as prisoners. It saw them as its crew. From that moment, the bond grew. The humans were no longer guests on a dead machine. They were part of it. KOR began adapting faster, sharing data, revealing maps of the ship the Rulathi didn't even know existed. And while the guards carried on, unaware of the growing connection between the ship and the humans, something powerful had already begun beneath their feet. A silent alliance had formed, one built not on programming but on trust. The Varex was no longer just a vessel. It was becoming something more, and it had chosen a side. The first sign of trouble came in the form of silence, subtle but enough to make the Rulathi guards pause. A hallway that was always lit suddenly dimmed for no reason. A door that should have locked refused to seal. Energy levels across the lower deck shifted just slightly, enough to confuse their patrol readings. At first, the guards blamed old wiring or minor glitches. The Varex was ancient, after all, and repurposed technology didn't always behave. But as the days passed, more things began to shift. Security drones returned with incomplete scans. Communication relays skipped messages. Food dispensers released meals early, causing disarray in the schedule. What the Rulathi didn't realize was that none of it was accidental. Hidden behind routine tasks, the human crew had begun moving like a silent current beneath the surface. Lyra had coordinated shifts in behavior to avoid attention, keeping her people scattered in a way that looked random, but was perfectly calculated. Matteo rewired sections of the ship's power grid so that small failures happened exactly when and where they needed to, keeping the guards occupied. Ada fed KOR phrases, ideas, and decision trees from human history, helping it learn how to plan, not just as a machine, but like a strategist. KOR had once been a warship, but now, under human guidance, it was learning a new kind of resistance. One that didn't rely on weapons, but on outthinking the enemy. The humans didn't want chaos, they wanted control. And they moved patiently, knowing that timing mattered more than speed. Systems once thought shut down lit up behind closed walls. Forgotten maintenance shafts became secret passageways. A hidden chamber, one not marked on any Rulathi map, was discovered and repurposed as a base of operations. It was there that Core spoke to them clearly for the first time, projecting its words through an interface it had rebuilt with Mateo's help. It didn't sound like a machine, it sounded calm, curious, and even protective. Command acknowledged, it said. Objective, restoration of purpose. For the first time since being captured, the humans had a partner that could see across the ship, reroute energy in moments, and unlock systems the guards didn't even know existed. They began to test the limits of their control. Lyra staged harmless distractions, false power failures, minor system alarms, to see how the guards responded. Core mapped their patterns in real time. Mateo introduced changes in the environmental controls, creating brief moments of discomfort that made the guards abandon posts without raising alerts. Ada, using her growing knowledge of the old language, inserted strange symbols into wall panels that made the Rulathi nervous, unsure if the ship was malfunctioning or being haunted by its past. Slowly, control began to shift, and then, without any clear signal, the change became undeniable. Doors sealed behind guards instead of in front of them. Control rooms stopped responding to Rulathi commands. Lights redirected them in circles, keeping them away from key locations. And in the heart of the ship, a panel once dark for decades lit up with a symbol, an ancient crest, one that had belonged to the ship during its time as a protector. Kaior had reclaimed its identity. The Rulathi tried to override the system, but every command was blocked. Human fingerprints were now part of the ship's core code. The uprising didn't look like a battle. It looked like order being rewritten. The prisoners didn't shout or fight. They moved into the control decks as if they belonged there, because now they did. The ship didn't see them as captives. It saw them as rightful commanders. Under Lyra's quiet direction, the Variks began to shift course, turning away from the barren prison world and toward open space. The name prison ship no longer fit. What had once been a cage was now a vessel of purpose. The Variks had become something new, a ship of liberation. And its journey was just beginning. The moment the Variks changed its course, the Rulathi knew something had gone wrong. The Empire, proud and sure of its control, never expected prisoners to challenge their authority, especially not those they considered too primitive to understand real power. When the command center lost contact with the ship and their override codes failed, panic spread beneath their polished calm. In response, they dispatched an armada, a sleek fleet of warships with glowing hulls and heavy command signatures, built to remind the galaxy who ruled the stars. They came not expecting a fight but a correction, believing they would simply retrieve a stolen ship and punish those who dared to dream beyond their place. What they did not know was that the Variks was no longer theirs to retrieve. By the time the Rulathi fleet reached the ship's position, the transformation was complete. With Kaior fully awakened and now working in complete harmony with the human crew, the Variks had turned into a ghost of its former warship self, familiar in shape but unpredictable in motion. Mateo had reconnected deep systems the Rulathi had forgotten existed. Ada had taught Kaior how to communicate using subtle energy pulses, confusing Rulathi sensors. Lyra had taken command not like a pirate, but like a strategist. Together, they weren't planning to fight. They were planning to outthink. As the enemy ships closed in, Kaior presented the crew with options, none of which involved direct attacks. Instead, they would use the ship's original design: stealth, deception, and strategic manipulation. The Variks activated its ancient signal-bending fields, making it appear in multiple places at once. The Rulathi sensors, unable to lock on, began chasing shadows. Kaior redirected power flows through nearby cosmic dust fields, using gravity shifts and heat signatures to mimic engine trails leading away from their actual position. While the enemy focused on false targets, Lyra had the ship rotate slowly along, a hidden vector, placing it directly in the fleet's blind spot. It was like watching a dancer move behind a curtain. The Rulathi had no idea the Varix was now among them. The human crew, small in number but sharp in thought, used the ship's restored communication grid to intercept fleet chatter. Ada sent back carefully crafted replies in the Rulathi command tone, tricking smaller ships into shifting formation. Matteo released electromagnetic bursts that appeared as system failures to the Rulathi sensors, forcing them to stop and recalibrate mid-flight. One by one, the fleet began to falter, not from damage but from confusion. Ships turned in the wrong direction. Orders contradicted each other. Coordinated attacks broke down as signals overlapped, and panic began to grow among the commanders. The humans never fired a weapon. They didn't need to. The Varix had become a mirror that turned the enemy's own systems against them. The fleet that arrived with certainty left in silence, scattered and embarrassed, unable to explain how a group of unarmed captives had defeated them with nothing but intellect, timing, and an old ship they had long stopped respecting. In the Eons, distance beyond the edges of Rulathi space, other species had been watching. Some were silent observers, others quiet sympathizers, but none expected what they saw that day: a prisoner ship outmaneuvering an empire. Whispers began to travel, faster than ships. Stories of a human-led vessel that escaped without violence, that used strategy to turn giants into ghosts, began to spread across communication networks and old trade routes. For the first time, the galaxy saw humanity not as broken captives, but as something new, unshaken, inventive, and impossible to corner. And aboard the Varix, now seen not as a relic but a beacon, Lyra stood at the command deck, eyes forward, with stars ahead and silence behind. They had not only escaped, they had made a statement. Without destruction, without a single shot, they had rewritten the rules. And the galaxy was beginning to listen. Long after the Rulathi fleet vanished into retreat, the silence of space carried a new sound, not the echo of war, but the quiet hum of change. Word spread across the galaxy, not through official broadcasts, but through whispers and scattered signals picked up in hidden corners of the stars. A single ship, once forgotten and assigned to carry those deemed too dangerous, had become something entirely unexpected. Across distant colonies and among quiet, watchful civilizations, the story grew. A group of human prisoners had taken control of an old Rulathi vessel not by force, but by outsmarting their captors. They hadn't escaped in flames. They had flown free with purpose. People began to ask questions. Who were these humans? What kind of species turns a prison into a symbol? As the tale traveled, it changed shape slightly in each telling, but one truth always remained. The Varix was no longer a prison ship. It had been reborn. Aboard the ship, the human crew had done more than survive. They had transformed themselves. The Rulathi had given them a label: prisoners. But Lyra, Ada, Matteo, and the others no longer wore that name. Core, the AI once abandoned and ignored, now operated not as a machine, but as a partner, guiding the ship with precision and intent. Together they gave the vessel a new name: Nova Conquered, a name that meant new harmony, a fresh beginning for those who refused to be chained. Lyra stood at the heart of the ship, no longer in hiding. Her voice now carried through a carefully crafted message that echoed across nearby systems. Her broadcast was not a demand or a threat. It was an invitation. She spoke calmly, with strength that came not from power but from truth. We were taken without cause, we were labeled without trial, but we found our voice not in anger but in unity. This ship is not a weapon, it is a place of choice. If you are oppressed, if you are silenced, if you believe your voice no longer matters, then hear this. You are not alone. Rise not with fists, but with thought. Stand not for destruction, but for the right to exist free. The message played on repeat, quietly, carried by Core's old communication arrays, reaching worlds where rebellion once seemed impossible. In places where fear had long ruled, people stopped and listened. Across distant planets, silent faces turned toward the stars. Even among species that had once avoided Earth or seen humans as a minor race, curiosity began to replace caution. The galaxy had not seen this before. Not a conquering force, but a rising wave of quiet resistance led by those who were never meant to lead. And slowly, ships began to follow. Not armies, not fleets, but individuals. Thinkers, engineers, dreamers, exiles. They came not for war, but for belonging. The Nova Concord became more than a ship. It became a symbol. Inside its halls, Lyra and her team welcomed those who brought ideas instead of weapons, questions instead of orders. Core adjusted itself to guide, not to command. Mateo built systems to teach others how to reclaim old tech, how to make it listen again. Ada became a voice of hope across languages, showing that freedom could be shared in any tongue. And through it all, humanity earned something far greater than power. They earned respect. Not because they were strong, but because they reminded the galaxy of something that had been forgotten, that even in silence, the spirit can rise. The story of the Nova Concord was no longer about escape. It was about becoming more. As the ship moved through uncharted stars, charting a path not for conquest but connection, the galaxy watched, no longer in doubt, but in wonder. And as Lyra stood on the command deck, looking at the stars ahead, she spoke the final words that would echo through time. They called us prisoners, but now they call us something else, impossible.